The early 2026 operation to abduct Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela is not even close to the first time that the United States has illegally interfered in the affairs of a Latin American country. However, this incursion and the rhetoric and justification surrounding it, I think, represent something distinct, something new. What we're witnessing now, I think, is a stupid guy's understanding of what imperialism is, based primarily on vanity, ego, and what looks cool on camera. Now, we are a very long way from doing coups for banana companies, covertly funding death squads to oppose leftist governments, and straight up lying to the public about weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East to justify long-term foreign entanglements. In each of those examples, Guatemala in 1954, Nicaragua in the 1980s, and Iraq in 2003, the United States was working on carrying out its hegemonic project. As scholar Thomas J. McCormick writes, hegemony means that one nation possesses such unrivaled supremacy, such predominant influence and economic power, military might, and political ideological leadership that no other power or combination of powers can prevail against it. Since the end of World War II, the American hegemonic project has consisted mostly of maintaining military dominance against our adversaries, specifically countries like the Soviet Union during the Cold War, providing a lucrative environment for American capital to extract and commodify resources, and promoting the ideology of American empire, free trade, free markets, liberal democracy, and the like. In pursuit of these aims, the United States has committed many, many atrocities. We've interfered in foreign elections, we've decapitated governments, we've funded right-wing death squads, we've moved illicit drugs and other contraband, the ilk. So one might naturally be forgiven for seeing what we've done to Venezuela and thinking that this is just another episode in the long lineage of the United States playing fast and loose with nations in Latin America. It certainly has all the trappings of a 1970s or 1980s style U.S. intervention in the region, but there are a few key differences that we should pay attention to that I think reveal a deeper, far less serious agenda and sort of tell us how we might oppose it. Historically, when the United States engages in regime change, that is, deconstructing a government and completely rebuilding it so that it fits U.S. interests, it involves something more than just kidnapping leadership. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush conducted what was likely an illegal regime change operation in Panama. This involved an invasion by U.S. forces and the capture of Manuel Noriega, the military dictator, who was first a CIA asset, by the way, surprise, surprise. Noriega had been indicted on drug smuggling and money laundering charges by an American federal grand jury. He refused to seize power after a loss in the 1989 Panamanian elections, prompting U.S. troops to flood the Panama Canal Zone, eventually leading to one Marine being shot and kicking off Operation Just Cause. The operation lasted about 2 weeks and culminated in the capture of Noriega, the crushing of the Panamanian military, and the installation of the rightful winner of the 1989 election. Even though this is one of the less immediately disastrous U.S. interventions, hundreds of civilians still died and thousands were displaced as a result. Now, at first glance, it sort of seems like the abduction of Nicolas Maduro mirrors that of Noriega in Panama in 1989, but the Venezuelan government is still entirely intact. The accusation against Maduro is that he's a quote-unquote narco-terrorist, a fake term, by the way, that illegally funnels drugs, fentanyl was the claim at first, but the Trump indictment only lists cocaine, and other contraband into the United States. Though, of course, if these charges are accurate, Maduro couldn't have possibly acted alone. The Department of Justice also indicted other high-ranking members of the Maduro government, but they're still operating in Venezuela. Moreover, Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president, has assumed the role of acting president. Needless to say, if this was an attempt at regime change, well, the regime hasn't changed. It's also kind of hard to believe that the Trump administration really cares about drug trafficking since they pardoned the former president of Honduras who was charged and convicted with essentially the same crimes as Maduro, but that's neither here nor there. Here, I'm not arguing in favor of another military operation to go into Venezuela and to get the rest of Maduro's government. I'm merely prodding at an internal inconsistency from the Trump administration. If Maduro's alleged drug empire is such a threat to the United States, and that drug empire couldn't have been operated or conducted by Maduro alone, but by other key members of Maduro's government, then how can the Trump administration claim that this was some kind of successful mission to cut off that drug operation? Now, Trump claims that Rodriguez is cooperating and has threatened follow-up operations if the Venezuelan government doesn't cede to his demands, so maybe the administration is simply waiting to see if taking Maduro will be enough to force change in the country. However, Rodriguez has already publicly condemned the operation and affirmed Maduro as Venezuela's true president. And on top of that, Trump has repeatedly claimed that the United States, we are going to run the country, as in run Venezuela, and it's still not clear what that even means. A quick disclaimer at this point, I feel it's important to note that there could have been any number of backdoor deals between military leadership or even the vice president herself and the Trump administration that secured Maduro's release on condition of something. We don't have a ton of information about that, if any at all, so I'm not going to speculate on it here, but it's always a possibility. At the very least, it should be clear to everybody that the intent here was never to create a safer or more democratic society within Venezuela, or spread democracy, as we used to say. Trump has already confirmed that he's not going to support Marina Corina Machado, a public leader of the opposition to Maduro, who dedicated her Nobel Peace Prize to Trump in 2025, and he's made no mention of Edmundo Gonzalez, the retired diplomat viewed by many countries as the rightful winner of the 2024 Venezuelan elections. Trump also dodged a question about releasing the political prisoners of the Maduro regime, saying, quote, "We haven't gotten to that yet. What we want to do now is fix up the oil." I just hope it's clear to everybody that this was never designed as a liberatory mission for the Venezuelan people, and it should not be treated as such. The entire Maduro government is still very much intact, and the acting president, his vice president, is still very much loyal to Maduro, and I've yet to see any sign that things will fundamentally change for the Venezuelan people. This has all the trappings of a typical US-backed regime change, but it very obviously is not. And to better understand the situation, I think we need to take a look at another factor, the oil. Presuppose for a moment that the Trump administration is capable of turning Rodriguez into a pliant cooperator for the interests of the United States. The question becomes, to what end? The most immediate concern for the Trump administration is not drugs, which is the false pretense that kicked all of this off to begin with, nor is it connections to Tren de Aragua, which Trump's own national security apparatus determined does not experience widespread cooperation with Maduro. But instead, the primary concern is oil. At the first press conference after Maduro's rendition, Trump repeatedly talked about the oil. And according to Reuters, quote, Trump said as part of the takeover, major U.S. oil companies would move into Venezuela and refurbish badly degraded oil infrastructure. And reiterating this message, Trump, when he was aboard Air Force One on January 4th, said he has spoken to oil companies and, quote, they want to go in so badly. Now, Venezuela's crude oil accounts for something like 17% of global reserves, the largest in the world. Many American oil companies were forced out of Venezuela during Hugo Chavez's presidency, with Chevron being the only company to still operate within the borders of Venezuela. With such rich natural resources up for grabs, one might think that American oil companies are itching to get back into Venezuela and benefit from a now privatized oil industry. And here, the intervention begins to sort of mimic Iraq 2003, where control of the oil was a primary motivator for the United States, even though the actual process of extraction took a little while to operate at full capacity. And this interpretation of events would certainly clear up some of the confusion about how the regime change wasn't really a regime change at all. But there are a couple issues with this view. First, anonymous sources within the oil industry have denied that their companies had any knowledge before or after the capture of Maduro. According to Reuters, one source said on January 5th, quote, nobody in those three companies has had conversations with the White House about operating in Venezuela pre-removal or post-removal to this point. As far as we can tell, and of course assuming that, oil companies aren't just straight up lying here, it doesn't seem like the oil industry asked for this intervention in the same way that the United Fruit Company asked President Eisenhower to intervene in Guatemala in 1954. In addition, much of Venezuela's oil infrastructure is in a sort of state of disrepair, which would take a years-long commitment and investment to refurbishing it for oil production, which is a tall order for oil companies that have been burned by Venezuelans' nationalization process in the past. And lastly, according to the Associated Press, a major shift in oil prices wasn't expected because Venezuela is a member of OPEC, so its production is already accounted for there. And there is currently a surplus of oil on the global market. So we have a bunch of factors here that sort of work against the idea that this intervention was purely for resource theft, in the same way that prior U.S. interventions have been to just carve up the land. And to further this idea, in October of last year, Maduro made an offer to the Trump administration for oil companies in America to invest in Venezuela. Under a deal discussed between a senior U.S. official and Mr. Maduro's top aides, the Venezuelan strongman offered to open up all existing and future oil and gold projects to American companies. This deal was rejected, of course, the boat strikes continued, and here we are today. And now I hear you saying it, okay, fine, maybe there's not that much money to be made, but we can block our adversaries like China from accessing Venezuelan oil. And that's a fine consideration, one that's not entirely out of line with what we did in Iraq in 2003. And it is true that in 2023, nearly 70% of Venezuelan crude oil was imported by China. However, those imports only amounted to roughly 4% of China's total crude imports, a non-trivial amount to be sure, but not backbreaking for a nation like China. The Trump administration also claims that Cuba relies heavily on Venezuelan oil, but this is evidence to me not of like a realist strategy to combat foreign influence, but an attempt to sort of lay the groundwork for future assaults on sovereign nations that we intend to launch. More on that in a little bit. So in short, oil executives deny being involved in this operation really at all because there's no guarantee for short-term or even long-term returns on investment given the dilapidated infrastructure and Venezuela's history of nationalization. Now, this is not intended to paint oil executives in a good light. Under no circumstances do you ever have to hand it to an oil company, but it's to sort of illustrate that I don't think this intervention happened at their request. Moreover, Maduro seemed at least somewhat willing to negotiate in good faith on this issue, and China doesn't stand to lose all that much from what's happened. Now, I can concede it's entirely possible that Trump spoke to one of his wealthy friends or even donors to the ballroom he's still trying to build and made promises behind closed doors about what Venezuelan oil production might look like. And it might even be the case that oil production through American companies will increase because of U.S. intervention and investment into Venezuela. But given the evidence today, it feels hard to conclude that we abducted Maduro primarily because it was the most sustainable way for us to have access to Venezuelan oil. I just don't think the evidence is there. Instead, what I think this is a stupid guy's idea of imperialism. If the Venezuelan regime hasn't really been changed, can't call it a regime change, and if resource extraction is not the most feasible reality, or at least not the primary concern, then to me, there's really only one option left. It's a performance of sorts. Consider for a moment the context. Trump's approval rating is falling, the tariffs have been on and off, ICE operations are met with broad disdain from the public, the economy has not improved for many people, and the administration is embroiled in a controversy that implicates the president with the most prolific pedophile child trafficker in modern history, Jeffrey Epstein. So in an attempt to sort of rekindle the domestic popularity of this administration, they seek out a foreign policy win. Trump orders some illegal strikes on boats off the coast of Venezuela, and eventually it culminates in the kidnapping of Maduro himself. This is not to say that this is a distraction necessarily from other political issues, although maybe they hope that it is, but it's a performance to showcase that they're still capable of being a big, strong bully and doing big, complex things. And viewing this as a performance can help explain a lot of the lingering questions we still have. If Maduro's regime itself is the problem, then why is it still entirely intact? Well, the capture of Maduro is symbolic and it's flashy, and it creates the illusion that Trump can get you anywhere at any time. The drugs and repression clearly don't matter to the Trump administration because they pardoned the former Honduran president who did basically the same thing as Maduro, but the capture of Maduro appears as a performance of enormous military might without obligating them to really do anything else. The same logic applies to Trump's claims that we're going to quote unquote run Venezuela. Running a foreign country appears like the strongman thing to do, when in reality, your officials like Secretary Marco Rubio are essentially denying that this is what's going to happen. If the oil companies aren't all that eager to get back into Venezuela, then why does Trump keep saying openly that this is all about the oil? Well, the forced extraction of natural resources from an unwilling country seems like something a big tough guy would do. And quite frankly, it's something that imperial powers have been known for doing in the past. Now, as previously stated, some semblance of American oil production might actually occur within the borders of Venezuela sometime under Trump's reign, but the actual extraction of resources from Venezuela is less important than what a strong man would look like or would appear to be doing in this same situation. I mean, famously, Trump wasn't in principle opposed to the Iraq war. He was just upset that we didn't keep any of the oil, so I feel like all of this tracks. The performance theory to explain all of this also covers why none of this, since September, was ever covert. It took years for the public to find out about historical interventions that the U.S. had conducted, but these strikes on boats in Venezuela and the plans for the land attacks were proudly professed to the press and broadcasted to every social media site. Rather than U.S. intelligence agencies working in the shadows as they normally do to foment a coup against a foreign leader we don't like, Maduro, Trump confirmed publicly to reporters that the CIA was involved in planning strikes inside of Venezuela. Susie Wiles, Trump's chief of staff, literally told Vanity Fair that the goal was to oust Maduro. None of this was a secret. None of this was covert. Sure, they lied in some cases, but they did literally nothing to try to cover their tracks. They wanted people to know what they were doing because this was a performance. They were performing the act of being the big bully in the backyard, pushing around much smaller, much weaker countries. I mean, look at this image of them in the quote-unquote situation room during the Maduro operation. This is a photo from Mar-a-Lago where they got some thin-ass black curtains and put them up around a table that Trump was sitting at, and in the background on the desktop screen is Twitter. They are screaming at us that all of this is a farce. And this interpretation of events extends to other aspects of the Trump administration as well, from the televised cabinet meetings to the videos of ICE and the edits of ICE detaining immigrants, oftentimes very innocent immigrants, or Secretary Pete Hegseth's speech at Quantico calling all of the generals fat and gay, or Trump's use of tariffs as a negotiation tactic, only for them to be repealed a day before they actually go into effect. These people desperately want to be viewed as serious political actors that deserve your respect. And the only way they know how to do that is by pretending to be strong and powerful and uncaring. Now, this is not to say that the performance itself doesn't have real material consequences for people. I mean, the ICE raids have been ruinous for families and communities. The tariffs have hurt the economy, and this attack on Venezuela will undoubtedly destabilize the country and the region and radicalize people around the world against us even further. That's also not to say that the performance of strength is the only consideration of this administration. While Trump is enamored with the idea of projecting strength onto our neighbors, Marco Rubio does have a genuine desire to see other governments in Latin America topple. I mean, both Trump and Rubio have already indicated that Cuba's up next, and even called attention to Colombia, Mexico, and Greenland, 3 U.S. allies. There's a genuine expansionist and imperialist desire here, and there's also the performance of what they think those things are supposed to look like. The primary concern of this administration, at least by my estimation, is how it appears externally. And when a government is motivated primarily by its facade, it lacks substance. This, I think, is best encapsulated in Trump's adoption of the Monroe Doctrine, an 1800s era decree used today as justification for the United States laying claim essentially to the entire Western Hemisphere, and Trump has renamed his version the Don Roe Doctrine.
They now call it the Don Roe Doctrine. I don't know. It's Monroe Doctrine.
Lacking any coherent domestic agenda that actually substantively improves the lives of U.S. citizens, all that's left for this regime is to act tough at home and abroad. And acting tough often involves brutalizing a lot of people. And then they have to insist that whatever they're doing is actually helping everybody when it's obvious that it isn't. Where prior presidents might have conducted foreign policy for the purposes of finding cheap resources for U.S. investment or toppling communist regimes as a way of combating the Soviet Union, the Trump administration attacks sovereign nations abroad because of some deeply held belief that we have a God-given right to push smaller countries around. And acting upon this bloodthirst has the effect of looking like they are a strong, coordinated imperialist power who knows what they're doing, guys, we promise. In my search for an analog to the U.S. intervention in Venezuela that we just conducted, I think I found one. And it's not from the 1950s or the 1970s or the era of Reagan. It happened just last year in June when the United States and Israel coordinated strikes on Iran. In that episode, the United States and Israel conducted airstrikes against Iranian nuclear facilities to destroy Iran's capability of creating a nuclear weapon. And then, in an assessment that surfaced soon after, it was revealed that the strikes only set back progress by a few months and that stockpiled uranium was in fact not destroyed. Despite all of this, Trump claimed victory, and Caroline Leavitt said the report was wrong and leaked by a, quote, low-level loser in the intelligence community. The attacks on Iran were perfectly useless. They served only to escalate tensions, and they were treated as an outright success from the strongest president to ever grace us with his presence. It is purely a performance of strength by summoning the aesthetics of former military excursions without any semblance of the intelligent planning that characterized prior administrations that were so much better at doing the imperialist thing. And if it is truly just a performance, then a performance demands an audience. The strategy really only works if people are either scared into submission or concede ideologically to the acts of the administration. If we call all of these actions out for what they are, a shameless, empty performance, and we mock the reckless and escalatory actions of this administration, then we can undermine the only real iota of legitimacy they have left, which is their aura farming. And this is why any rhetorical capitulation to the Trump administration right now, after their attack on Venezuela, affirms their narrative. And I would be remiss here if I didn't give a shout out to my favorite opposition party, Chuck Schumer's Democrats.
Go Bills.
One congressional Democrat anonymously told Axios that not embracing Maduro's ousting, quote, looks weak if you don't acknowledge when there's a win for our country, then you lose all credibility. Now, aside from the fact that this kind of military adventurism almost always ends poorly both for the United States and for the countries that are being exposed to imperial aggression, accepting the framing that Trump was right to do this ignores that this operation wasn't done to actually oust the Maduro government. The regime is still very much intact. But to satiate the need for this administration to appear like a bully in the backyard, the guy who through force of violence can get whatever he wants. If the opposition party, and it feels crazy to call Democrats an opposition party, but just stay with me for a second. If the opposition party is pushed into silence or even celebrates Maduro's abduction just so they don't appear weak, then why wouldn't Trump go after Cuba or Mexico or Colombia or Greenland or any other nation for future affirmation of the fact that he is indeed a strong man? You have to reject the premise that doing these things, doing this kind of imperialism, is good for anyone at any point. Lamenting that your party looks weak when you're speaking to the press anonymously is the most Democrat thing I've ever seen, but whatever. To summarize all of this, our latest intervention into Venezuela was pure imperial adventurism, steeped in a might makes right ideology that promises violence for the sake of violence, all to construct a facade of overwhelming power for this government. The Maduro government is still fully intact, oil companies are hesitant about going into Venezuela at all, and the drug issue was always a false pretense from the very beginning. Here, the true aim of the Trump administration is to appear strong and lay the groundwork for future military excursions against Cuba, Colombia, Mexico, Greenland, and whoever the else they want to target. After all, if all of this is just an attempt to look strong, then the performance can never really end, which is why we absolutely have to resist it at the very beginning. As McCormick states, quote, hegemony is always impermanent. Hegemony undermines the very economic supremacy upon which it necessarily must rest. Many, many obituaries have been written about the American empire. This is not one of them. But we should see this for what it is. A wannabe strongman with falling popularity, violently lashing out against countries abroad because he desperately wants to prove just how strong he can be. And the performance of strength here instead reveals weakness. Trump, in my estimation, is a manifestation of the decline of U.S. hegemony. He constantly rejects his neoconservative predecessors while very clearly basing his military commands off of what they did in the past. But this time, without any of the strategic know-how when it comes to hiding the machinations of empire. To borrow a quote from Karl Marx, first is tragedy, then is farce. And the farce may, unfortunately for us, be far more destructive than anything that came before it. This has been a dramatic reading of an article that was first posted on our Substack, so if you want more of this before these kinds of videos come out, then go ahead and check out the Substack. Who knows, you might like what you find, I don't know. And if you want early access to all of our content, then please subscribe on Patreon. You get early access to all of our stuff. I believe these videos will probably be posted as early access coming up pretty soon. Who knows, maybe stay tuned. And also please subscribe to the second channel that this is posted on right now. We would really appreciate it. We're always trying to build out our mechanisms for indoctrinating the public. So your subscription and your liking and sharing this video on the second channel here would be very, very helpful. Please do that. Anyways, thanks for listening. We love you very much. Subscribe, like, do all the things, and I'll see you later.